My name is Clara Mitchell. I'm 29 years old, a wedding photographer based in Seattle, and last year my parents chose a beach vacation over my wedding day. They weren't sick. They weren't stuck on the other side of the world. They were in Cancun, smiling for pictures with my sister's family, while I walked down the aisle without them. And the caption on their post? Perfect family trip with the people who matter most. Sit back, relax, and stay with me until the very end of this story. I share this not because I want sympathy, but because I know I'm not the only one who has had to face the painful reality that sometimes the people who are supposed to love us the most end up being the ones who wound us the deepest. If you've ever been overlooked, dismissed, or made to feel like an afterthought in your own family, you'll understand why this story matters. Before we go further, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments if you've ever had to set boundaries with your family. I'd love to hear your experience. From the outside, my life looks pretty ordinary. I take pictures for a living, weddings, engagements, portraits. I capture those small moments that couples treasure forever. But what people don't see is the irony. Every time I photograph a bride with her proud parents, it reminds me of the empty space at my own wedding, the chairs that should have been filled by Richard and Margaret, my parents, who had decided that Victoria, my older sister, was the only child worth celebrating. The truth is, that day in Cancun wasn't an accident. It wasn't a simple scheduling conflict. It was the result of a lifetime of choices, a lifetime of favoritism, a lifetime of them showing me in 100 different ways that I was never going to measure up. And while their absence on my wedding day broke me, it also forced me to finally see clearly. I grew up in the Bay Area, in a picture-perfect neighborhood. Our house looked like something from a magazine. White fence, manicured lawn, colonial windows. People thought we were the model family. But inside, there was an unspoken ranking. At the top, my parents, who valued status above all else. Right below, my sister Victoria, 6 years older, who was destined for greatness in their eyes. And at the bottom, me. Always me. When Victoria brought home perfect grades, the fridge became her stage for weeks. When I did the same, my mother barely nodded. When she was accepted to medical school, there was a lavish party with champagne and colleagues. When I graduated with honors in fine arts, they didn't even show up. My father dismissed my work constantly. Photography is not a real career. It's a hobby. You need to think about something practical. Still, I tried. I compromised. I double majored at Berkeley in business and fine arts. I worked harder than anyone else, chasing both my dream and their approval. I won a regional award, got featured in the newspaper, and sent them the clipping, thinking maybe this time. My mother's response? That's nice, but did you see Victoria's article in the New England Journal of Medicine? That was the rhythm of my life. My wins were invisible, hers were magnified. And yet, I kept hoping. Hoping that one day, they would see me. Hoping that one day, I'd be enough. Years later, after building a career on my own terms, after meeting Ethan, the man who loved me for who I was, I thought maybe my wedding would be that moment. The day they'd finally stand in my corner, if only because tradition demanded it. But instead, they chose to fly to Cancun and post smiling pictures with the caption, "The people who matter most." I can't explain the exact feeling that went through me when I saw those posts. Anger, humiliation, grief, but most of all, clarity. That day, I stopped pretending their absence was about bad timing. It was about choice. And if they could so easily choose a vacation over their daughter's wedding, then maybe I needed to start choosing myself too. So let me ask you, if your parents publicly declared, in so many words, that you didn't matter, would you still chase their approval? Or would you finally learn to stand on your own? That night, as I stared at those photos of my family on the beach, I realized I was at a crossroads. Either I could keep trying to be the daughter they wanted, forever bending myself to fit their mold, or I could finally walk away from their expectations and live a life that made sense to me. And that decision, the one I made in the aftermath of my so-called trivial wedding, changed everything. Because what happened next wasn't just about weddings or vacations. It was about money, betrayal, boundaries, and the moment I finally learned how to put myself first. I grew up in the kind of neighborhood where appearances meant everything. Manicured lawns, polished cars in the driveway, families in matching sweaters for Christmas cards. Our two-story colonial in the Bay Area stood tall among them, complete with the white picket fence and rose bushes my mother tended more for show than passion. People would walk by and smile, and I knew exactly what they were thinking. What a perfect family. From the outside, we were flawless. Inside, though, perfection was a performance, and every performance has a script. In our family, that script cast me in the role of disappointment. At the top of the hierarchy were my parents, Richard and Margaret. My father was a corporate lawyer, known for his sharp tongue and sharper suits. My mother was a hospital administrator, meticulous in her appearance and relentless in her pursuit of social status. They were the kind of people who spoke about connections more than friendships, who measured worth by job titles and income brackets. Their lives revolved around image, what others saw, what others thought, what others whispered at country clubs and charity dinners. Just below them stood my sister, Victoria, 6 years older, and their undeniable pride. She was everything they wanted in a daughter: ambitious, disciplined, brilliant. Even as a child, she seemed to know exactly how to play her role. Straight as, piano recitals, science fairs, debate championships she delivered, and they adored her for it. Her accomplishments were celebrated, with dinners at fine restaurants, parties with colleagues, framed certificates on the walls. Victoria didn't just shine, she was allowed to shine. And then there was me, the afterthought, the footnote. From as far back as I can remember, I knew I was the one who didn't quite measure up. I still remember being 7 years old, coming home clutching a drawing I had made in art class. It was a messy watercolor of our house, with my family standing in front of it. I had worked so hard to make sure I captured the details: the roses my mother loved, my father's glasses, Victoria's long hair. I handed it to my mother, waiting for her smile, for her praise. She glanced at it and set it on the counter. "That's nice, Clara. Wash your hands for dinner." 2 weeks later, Victoria came home with a spelling bee trophy. My parents cleared a whole shelf in the living room to display it. My painting had long since disappeared into the trash. As I grew older, the difference only sharpened. When Victoria brought home perfect grades, her report card was displayed on the fridge like a trophy. When I brought home the same, my mother barely looked up from her phone. "That's what's expected of you," she said once. Nothing special. I learned quickly that my achievements weren't cause for celebration. They were obligations, boxes to be checked without acknowledgement. By the time Victoria reached high school, she was already being groomed for greatness. My parents spoke of her future as though it were preordained. Medical school, prestigious residency, a career saving lives. They spoke of me in vaguer terms. "Clara will find her way eventually." It wasn't said cruelly, but dismissively, the way one might talk about an unreliable appliance. They didn't expect brilliance from me. They expected nothing. And somehow, that hurt more than outright criticism. One evening when I was 12, we gathered in the dining room for dinner. My father had opened a bottle of wine. My mother had set out the good china. And I could tell something important was coming. Halfway through the meal, my father raised his glass. "To Victoria," he said proudly. "She's been accepted to the Science Magnet program. This is the first step toward medical school." My mother beamed, tears in her eyes. I clapped too, because what else could I do? When my father noticed me, he added, almost as an afterthought, "Clara, I'm sure you'll do well in your classes this year too." That was it. No celebration, no toast, just a reminder to meet the bare minimum. Moments like that piled up. They seemed small in isolation, but together they carved deep lines into my sense of self. I was never enough, never remarkable, never the child who made them proud. It wasn't just academics. Socially, too, Victoria was paraded around like a prize. At family gatherings, my mother would introduce her with glowing titles. "This is my daughter Victoria, future doctor." When it was my turn, the words were clipped, almost embarrassed. "This is my younger daughter Clara, she's still figuring things out." Sometimes they didn't even mention my name, just waved a hand vaguely in my direction. I used to wonder if anyone in those rooms even knew what I liked, what I wanted, what made me, me. The most painful part wasn't the neglect itself, it was the silence that followed whenever I tried to push back. Once, when I was 15, I asked my father why they never celebrated my achievements the way they did Victoria's. He sighed, as though my question was childish. "Because you need to understand reality, Clara. Not everyone is destined for greatness. Some people contribute quietly. That's your role." He said it matter-of-factly, not cruelly, but the words lodged inside me like a splinter that never healed. From then on, I stopped asking. I stopped expecting. I learned to swallow the disappointment, to keep my victories to myself. I smiled at Victoria's parties, clapped at her speeches, sat through dinners where her accomplishments were the main course, and mine weren't even the garnish. On the surface, I played the part of the supportive younger sister. Inside, I was screaming. Looking back now, I think the hardest part wasn't being overlooked. It was watching them celebrate someone else so loudly, so extravagantly, while acting as though I were invisible. The constant comparison carved away at me year after year, until I wasn't even sure who I was outside of their shadow. Still, deep down, I held on to a fragile hope. Maybe one day, I thought, I'd do something so undeniable that they would finally see me. That they would finally say, "We're proud of you, Clara." That longing fueled me in ways I didn't fully understand then. It would take years before I discovered the thing that lit me up inside, the passion that made me feel alive. But the seeds of it were already there, buried under layers of disappointment and silence, waiting for the moment I would finally step out of the role they had written for me. And that moment came the first time I picked up a camera. It happened almost by accident, the day I discovered what felt like my reason for existing. I was 16, sitting in the back of my high school art class, restless and invisible, as usual. The other students seemed to have a natural talent for painting, sculpting, sketching. I had always felt like an imposter in that room, fumbling with brushes, my drawings stiff and lifeless. But then Mrs. Lewis, my art teacher, placed an old Nikon camera in my hands. "Try this, Clara," she said with the kind of quiet encouragement I rarely received at home. "See the world through this." The moment I lifted that camera to my eye, everything shifted. The classroom, with its harsh fluorescent lights and cluttered desks, blurred into the background. Inside the frame I saw angles, contrasts, details I'd never noticed before. A pencil rolling off a desk, a student biting her lip as she concentrated, dust particles suspended in sunlight. For the first time in my life, the world seemed to hold secrets only I could see, and the camera was the key to unlocking them. That night, I stayed up late in the darkroom, the smell of developer chemicals stinging my nose, the red light casting eerie shadows. I watched as the first photograph slowly appeared in the tray, the grainy black and white of my classmate leaning against a window, her expression caught between laughter and thought. It was magic, no, it was more than magic. It was proof that I could capture a fleeting moment and hold it still. Forever. For the next few weeks, I lived with that Nikon slung around my neck. I photographed everything: my shoes on the pavement, reflections in rain puddles, my neighbor's dog chasing its tail, the way the evening light hit the cracked paint on our fence. It was as though I'd been sleepwalking for years, and suddenly woke up. But at home, my newfound passion was treated like a nuisance. My mother frowned when I pointed the lens at her while she was arranging flowers. "Clara, don't be ridiculous. Put that thing away." My father barely looked up from his briefcase when I tried to show him prints from the darkroom. "Photography isn't a career," he said, his tone final. "It's a distraction." For the first time in my life, I didn't care. Their dismissal stung, but it didn't extinguish the fire inside me. If anything, it pushed me further. The more they ignored me, the more determined I became to prove that what I saw through the lens mattered. I started sneaking into the city on weekends, taking the bus into San Francisco with rolls of film in my backpack. I wandered the streets, drawn to alleys and sidewalks, photographing buskers playing guitar, children chasing pigeons in Union Square, couples holding hands when they thought no one was watching. The city was alive with stories, and I was the one who could freeze them in time. One Saturday, I captured a street performer, a violinist with wild hair and a tattered coat playing in front of the ferry building. His bow was frayed, his shoes were worn through, but his eyes were closed, lost in the music. When I developed that photo, his face emerged like a painting, lined with hardship, but luminous with something unbreakable. I stared at it for hours, realizing I had caught not just his image but his essence. Mrs. Lewis noticed. She pulled me aside one day after class and said, "You have an eye, Clara. Not everyone does. Don't let anyone tell you this isn't real." Her words lodged in me like a spark of validation I had been starving for. By junior year, I was entering local competitions. The first time I saw my name listed as a finalist, I almost couldn't believe it. When I won second place at a regional contest, the local newspaper ran a small feature about me, and one of my photographs, a candid shot of two elderly women laughing on a park bench. I clipped it out and mailed it home, certain this was the moment my parents would finally acknowledge me. The call came that evening. My mother's voice was flat, uninterested. "I saw your little article," she said. "It was nice. But did you see that Victoria just published her research in the New England Journal of Medicine? That's real recognition." I felt my throat tighten as she spoke. I had already seen the article, of course. I had even sent Victoria flowers. But no one had thought to send me so much as a text that said, "Good job." The silence on their end was deafening. That night, alone in my dorm room, I pinned the newspaper clipping above my desk. It was flimsy, nothing compared to the glossy plaques that decorated Victoria's walls, but it was mine. It meant something, even if it meant nothing to them. At UC Berkeley, I carried that tension with me like a second skin. My parents had only agreed to pay part of my tuition if I double majored in business along with fine arts, so that I would have a real career to fall back on. The workload was brutal. I'd stay up until dawn, editing photos, then drag myself half asleep into accounting lectures. On weekends, I shot weddings for couples who couldn't afford the big studios, slowly building a portfolio. There were nights when I sat on the floor of my dorm, surrounded by prints and assignments, too exhausted to cry, too determined to quit. My roommate Olivia once said, "You're killing yourself trying to please everyone. Pick one thing." But I couldn't. Deep down, I was still that little girl holding up a watercolor painting, waiting for someone to notice. Except now, I had found the one thing that gave me a voice. The camera never dismissed me. It never told me I was expected, not exceptional. Every time I pressed the shutter, I was reminded that what I saw mattered, even if the people who should have cared the most refused to see it. And slowly, despite the exhaustion, despite the lack of recognition, something inside me hardened into resolve. If my parents would never celebrate me, I would learn to celebrate myself. If they couldn't see my worth, I would capture it frame by frame until the world did. It was this stubborn determination that carried me through late nights, endless classes, and countless wedding gigs, and it was this determination that set the stage for the next chapter of my life. Because while photography gave me purpose, love would eventually give me the courage to fight for it, and that love arrived when I least expected it. When I walked away from my marketing job, my father called it career suicide. I still remember the way his voice sliced through the phone, sharp and cold. "Clara, you're throwing away a stable income to chase a fantasy. Don't come crying to us when you fail." It was the kind of warning meant to scare me back into line. And maybe years earlier it would have. But by then, I was tired of chasing approval that never came. I had spent 3 years working in an office that drained me, pouring every bit of free time and energy into weddings on weekends, editing photos until dawn. I was exhausted, but I had also built something real. Clients referred me to friends, Strangers emailed after seeing my work online. Couples told me I captured them more authentically than anyone else. For the first time, I could hear a different kind of voice, my own, telling me to leap. The first year on my own was brutal. I lived on cheap noodles and coffee, cut coupons, shared a cramped two-bedroom with two roommates, and took any job that came my way: weddings, engagements, even newborn shoots in poorly lit living rooms. I carried gear up flights of stairs, edited in coffee shops until they closed, and learned through mistakes that sometimes cost me more than I earned. But slowly, I began to find my rhythm. Word of mouth spread. My weekends filled months in advance. I saved enough to buy my first professional camera body outright, and with every wedding, I saw my style taking shape: less posed perfection, more raw emotion. A tear caught before it fell, a glance between a bride and her grandmother, laughter that couldn't be faked. I was still invisible at family gatherings. My mother introduced me dismissively as our younger daughter. She's doing photography. Then she'd launch into a proud monologue about Victoria's residency, her publications, her growing family. My father never asked about my business, never visited my website, never acknowledged the awards I began to collect. But I had clients who cried happy tears when they saw my work, couples who hugged me like family after their weddings, strangers who emailed me with words like timeless and real. Their validation began to stitch together what my parents had torn down for years. And then, one autumn afternoon, during a wedding in Portland, I met Ethan. He wasn't the groom. He wasn't even part of the wedding party until I noticed him from behind my camera. He was the best man, tall and unassuming, his suit slightly wrinkled, his tie not perfectly tied. At first glance, he blended into the background. But as I followed the day through my lens, my eyes kept returning to him. I watched as he placed a steadying hand on the groom's shoulder before the ceremony, making him laugh when his nerves threatened to spill over. During the reception, he carried plates for an elderly guest, struggling to balance them. When children grew restless on the dance floor, he crouched down, making silly faces until they erupted into giggles. He wasn't the loudest in the room, but somehow he was everywhere, quietly making things better for everyone else. By the time I was packing up my gear, I realized I had taken more photos of Ethan than I had of the centerpieces or the cake. Something about him drew my attention in ways I couldn't quite explain. And then, as I zipped my bag, he walked up to me with a smile that felt disarmingly warm. "So, you're the one who sees everything," he said, nodding toward my camera. "That's my job," I replied, caught off guard. "To notice the moments everyone else might miss." "Well," he said, pulling a small slip of paper from his pocket, "I noticed you too, in case you'd ever want to be on the other side of the camera." He pressed his number into my hand. I should have laughed, or brushed it off, but instead, I slipped it into my pocket like something fragile and precious. Our first date was simple coffee at a small cafe, followed by a walk through a park near his school. Ethan told me about teaching fourth grade, about the way he loved watching kids discover their own talents, about how he believed education was less about rules and more about possibility. The way his eyes lit up when he spoke made me feel something I hadn't felt in years. Seen. Really seen. He wasn't measuring me by a yardstick of titles or income. He wasn't comparing me to anyone. He was listening. As our relationship deepened, I realized how different his world was from the one I'd been raised in. His parents, both retired teachers, invited me over for dinner the first time I visited. They asked questions about my photography, listened intently as I explained my work, and even asked to see some of my prints. When I showed them, his mother gasped softly. "You captured something so real," she whispered. In their home, my work wasn't dismissed as a hobby, it was valued. 6 months later, I introduced Ethan to my parents. I shouldn't have expected anything different, but some part of me still hoped. My father shook his hand perfunctorily, already turning away. My mother made a point to comment on teachers being underpaid, and wondered aloud why someone with my education hadn't chosen a more stable partner. On the drive home, Ethan glanced at me. Why do they seem disappointed in me when they don't even know me? It's not you, I told him. It would have been anyone who isn't a doctor or lawyer or CEO. That's how they measure worth. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "That's their loss. Because they're missing out on knowing a pretty wonderful daughter." That was the moment I knew, not just that I loved him, but that he was the person I wanted to build a life with. Someone who saw me for who I was, not for who I wasn't. Someone who valued me in all the ways my parents never could. Our love grew alongside my career. As my calendar filled and my studio expanded, Ethan became my anchor. On nights when I was editing until dawn, he sat beside me, grading papers, occasionally reaching out to squeeze my hand. When a client raved about my work, he celebrated with me like it was his own victory. When I doubted myself, he reminded me of the girl who had once picked up a camera and discovered her own worth. And for the first time, I started to believe that maybe I didn't need my parents' approval after all. Maybe the life I was building with my art, with my business, with Ethan, was enough. More than enough. But as we grew stronger together, my parents' disapproval only grew louder in its silence. At family gatherings, my mother's introductions became sharper, her pride in Victoria more ostentatious, her dismissal of me more cutting. My father rarely looked at Ethan, as if refusing to acknowledge that he could matter. The contrast between their world and mine was stark, and standing in the middle of it, I began to realize something important. I had been running my whole life, running to prove myself, running to keep up, running to earn what was never offered. But with Ethan by my side, I started to wonder what would happen if I stopped running altogether. That question lingered in my heart as the seasons changed, and when Ethan finally knelt down one crisp autumn morning during a hike, pulling a ring from his pocket, I felt the answer crystallize. I didn't need my parents' permission, their approval, or their applause. What I needed was love that was steady, real, and mine. What I didn't know then was that saying yes to Ethan would lead me straight into the hardest test of my life. Because if building my career had taught me resilience and finding love had taught me worth, then planning our wedding would show me exactly where I stood in my family and just how little space they were willing to give me. When Ethan proposed, it wasn't the elaborate kind of engagement my parents would have bragged about. There was no photographer hiding in the bushes, no perfectly orchestrated setup, no audience. It was just the two of us on a trail in the Columbia River Gorge, standing near a waterfall where autumn leaves spun through the air like confetti. He knelt in damp soil, his voice unsteady, and asked me to share my life with him. My answer came through tears, a simple yes that felt like the most certain thing I'd ever spoken. It was imperfect, real, and exactly what I wanted. Planning the wedding should have been joyful. I had photographed hundreds of ceremonies, watched couples drive themselves into debt over floral arches and ballroom rentals, witnessed brides sob over napkin colors. Ethan and I wanted none of that. We chose a garden in Vancouver, Washington, simple, intimate, filled with wildflowers and sunlight. 70 guests, mostly friends, and extended family. People who had walked with us through life. It was never about spectacle, it was about meaning. But in the back of my mind, there was always the question, would my parents come? Inviting them felt like walking a tightrope. I knew their disdain for anything that wasn't grand. I knew the way they compared every event to the elaborate parties they threw for Victoria's milestones. Still, I wanted to believe that a wedding, even a modest one, was something they couldn't ignore. So I sent the invitations with a handwritten note tucked inside, telling them how much it would mean to me if they were there. Weeks passed with no response. The silence gnawed at me. I finally drove down to their home in the Bay Area, my stomach twisted into knots as I parked outside the house I'd grown up in. It looked the same as ever. The manicured lawn, the polished car in the driveway, the house that had always seemed too pristine for the chaos it hid inside. My mother served me tea in the good china she reserved for guests, not family. My father sat across from me in his leather chair, his posture impeccable. I tried to steady my voice as I asked if they had received the invitation. My mother's lips pressed into a thin line. Yes, we did. but I'm afraid we have a conflict." "What conflict?" I asked, though I already felt the answer forming like a bruise. "Your sister's family is visiting that weekend. We've already made plans," my father said. His tone was flat, like he was delivering a business report. "Couldn't they visit the week before? Or after? This is my wedding day." My voice cracked, but I held my gaze. My father's eyes hardened. "Let's be frank, Clara. Victoria is a surgeon. Her responsibilities are far greater than a small garden ceremony. She saves lives. You take pictures." The words landed like a slap. My mother added, almost gently, "Your wedding is important to you. But it's hardly the event of the year. Perhaps if it were at a more substantial venue, or if Ethan held a more established position. Like a doctor," my father finished unnecessarily. I sat frozen, tea cooling in my hands, the weight of their judgment pressing down until I could hardly breathe. They weren't just saying no, they were telling me, again, that I was trivial. That my love, my career, my choices, none of it was enough. I left their house with a hollow clarity. For 3 decades, I had begged them to see me. That day, I finally understood they never would. So on June 12th, my wedding went on without them. The weather was perfect, as though the universe itself had decided to make up for their absence. Sunlight spilled through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the rows of white chairs. Blue and purple wildflowers lined the aisle, their colors vivid against the green. My dress was lace, vintage-inspired, the kind of gown I could move in. Zoe, my friend and makeup artist, kept my look natural because she knew I hated the mask of heavy makeup. "How are you feeling?" she asked as she brushed blush onto my cheeks. "Happy," I whispered. "Sad. Angry. All of it at once." "Normal," she said. "But look at yourself. You're radiant." When my Uncle Jack offered me his arm to walk me down the aisle, my throat tightened. My Aunt Karen sat in the front row, tears in her eyes, smiling with the kind of pride I had always longed for from my own mother. And as I stepped into the garden, surrounded by people who chose to be there, the ache in my chest eased just a little. The ceremony was everything I wanted. Ethan's vows made people laugh and cry in equal measure. Mine were steadier, quieter. But when I promised to see him the way he always saw me, he squeezed my hand, and I felt my heart swell. When the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, the cheers rang louder than the absence I'd been bracing for. At the reception, laughter floated through the air, glasses clinked, and friends danced barefoot under the stars. I should have felt whole. But in the quiet moments, I found myself glancing at my phone, waiting for a text, a voicemail, anything. Just 2 words. "Congratulations, Clara." Nothing came. Later that night, in the hotel room, curiosity pulled me to my phone again. Notifications lit the screen. My mother's social media page was filled with photos, smiling family portraits against the turquoise waters of Cancun, dinner at a beachfront restaurant, my father raising a glass in a toast. The caption read, "Perfect family vacation with the people who matter most." I scrolled, my chest tightening with each image. They hadn't just skipped my wedding. They had planned this trip deliberately, knowing it fell on the same weekend. It wasn't a conflict of schedules. It was a choice, a statement. When Ethan came out of the shower, he found me sitting on the edge of the bed, tears running silently down my face as I clutched my phone. He didn't say anything at first. He just sat beside me, wrapped his arms around me, and let me cry into his shirt. "They planned it," I choked out. "They chose Cancun over me." "I know," he said softly. "And I'm so sorry." I cried until I was empty, until exhaustion pulled me into sleep. But even then, the images haunted me, the family I was born into, laughing together on a beach, while I started a new life without them. I didn't know it yet, but their absence at my wedding was only the beginning. Because soon after, another betrayal would surface, one that reached beyond emotions into something far more tangible: money, responsibility, and the power to ruin everything I had worked so hard to build. And when that moment came, I would finally be forced to decide, just how much I was willing to sacrifice for people who had already shown me I was nothing more than an afterthought. It was just a few weeks after the wedding when the phone calls started. At first, I ignored them. 7 missed calls in one afternoon from my father wasn't normal, but it wasn't unheard of either. I assumed it was some trivial matter, something he wanted, or some favor disguised as family responsibility. But the voicemails told a different story. His voice, usually composed and commanding, carried a sharp edge of panic. "Clara, call me immediately about the Madison property loan." The second voicemail, an hour later, was more insistent. "This is serious. The bank has been sending notices. Call me back." And then the third one, almost frantic. "The payments haven't been made. They're threatening legal action. Call me right away." My stomach dropped. The Madison property. Just hearing those words made me feel sick. 3 years earlier, my father had asked me to co-sign a commercial real estate loan on a building on Madison Avenue in New York. At the time, I had been newly out of school, still clinging to the hope that maybe if I helped him, he would finally see me as capable, as someone worth involving in his world. He assured me it was a formality. "You won't have to do anything," he said. "Your name just makes the paperwork cleaner for tax reasons. I'll handle everything, the payments, the tenants, the management. It's a guaranteed investment." Against my better judgment, I signed. It was one of the few times he had ever extended his hand to me, and I was pathetically grateful for the chance to be included, to feel like I belonged in the family narrative. Now, sitting in the park after finishing an engagement shoot, I listened to those messages, each one heavier than the last. My hands shook as I dialed his number. He picked up on the first ring. "Where have you been?" he snapped. "I've been trying to reach you all day." "I was working, Dad," I said, forcing calm into my voice. "What's going on with the Madison loan?" "The management company has been incompetent," he said, his tone laced with fury. "The building's been half empty, tenants leaving left and right. Rental income hasn't covered the loan. And the payments, well, there's been a shortfall." I swallowed hard. "But you've been making the payments, right?" There was a pause. "Not recently. With the expenses from the Cancun trip and the kids' school tuition, things have been tight." It took me a second to process what he had just admitted. Cancun, the same trip they had taken instead of coming to my wedding. He had chosen a vacation over keeping up with loan payments on a property that had my name on the paperwork. "How many payments have you missed?" I asked. 3, he admitted, though his tone suggested even he knew it was worse than that. "But the bank sent the notices to the property, not to me. I only found out when they called yesterday. 3 missed payments. My name tied to the loan. My credit, which I had spent years building carefully as I grew my business, now in jeopardy." I felt the ground tilt under me. "I need you to transfer $40,000 to cover the missed payments and penalties," he said, his voice snapping back to its usual authoritative tone, as if this was just another transaction. "Once that's cleared, we can discuss restructuring the loan or selling the building." $40,000? My voice cracked. "Dad, I just paid for a wedding and a honeymoon. I don't have that kind of money lying around." "You have a successful business," he pressed. "This is family. Your credit is at stake too. You can't afford not to." The irony cut deep. My wedding was trivial, a distraction, unworthy of their presence. But my money, my credit, my livelihood, that was family property, available on demand. "I need time to think," I said, my voice trembling but steady enough to hold. "This can't wait," he barked. "The bank will move toward foreclosure by the end of the week." "Then it's already waited too long," I replied, and I hung up. That night, I spread documents across the kitchen table, Ethan sitting beside me with quiet steadiness. I called a lawyer friend who specialized in real estate. I called my financial advisor. I even reached out to a credit repair specialist. Piece by piece, the picture became clearer and uglier. The Madison property had never been the sure thing my father promised. It had struggled since the beginning. Occupancy was low, expenses high, and instead of building a reserve fund, my father had siphoned off any profit for his lifestyle. He hadn't missed just 3 payments, he had missed 5. The first 2 had been automatically covered by reserves, but by the time he stopped altogether, it was right around the same month they booked the Cancun vacation. My advisor's voice was blunt. It looks like he used your name as collateral while he spent freely elsewhere. It's not mismanagement, Clara. It's prioritization. He chose the vacation over the loan. Something inside me snapped. For years, I had absorbed their indifference, their cutting words, their absence at my wedding. But this was different. This wasn't just emotional. This was financial sabotage. And it had my name written all over it. The next evening I called him back. He answered immediately. Tell me you have the money ready. No, I said simply. Silence. Then his voice, sharp and incredulous. What do you mean no? This affects you too. Be reasonable. I am being reasonable, I said. I've spoken to lawyers, to financial advisors, to the bank. I know exactly how bad this island. You've always been dramatic, he said dismissively. This isn't about drama, it's about responsibility. Responsibility? The word came out like a laugh, bitter and hollow. Where was your responsibility when you stopped making payments to fund a luxury vacation? Where was your responsibility when you signed my name onto a sinking property? You're overreacting. Family comes first. Family. The same word they had thrown in my face my whole life. Family. When it suited them. Family. When it cost me. I took a deep breath. If my wedding was trivial to you, then this financial crisis is trivial to me. I won't transfer the money. The line went silent for a beat before his voice exploded. You will regret this. When the foreclosure ruins your credit, when the family hears what you've done, you'll regret it. I hung up before the words could sink in. My hands shook, but my heart was steady. For the first time, I had said no. That night, Ethan held my hand across the cluttered table of papers. How do you feel? He asked quietly. Lighter, I whispered. Like I've been carrying a weight my whole life and finally set it down. But as I stared at the documents, the reality remained. The bank still had my name. The foreclosure was still looming. And the fallout from my parents, from extended family, from the world they controlled was only just beginning. What I didn't realize then was that saying no was only the first step. The storm that followed would test me in ways I had never imagined and force me to decide once and for all whether I was willing to stand on my own against the people who had always insisted I stay beneath them. The morning after my final call with my father, I woke with a strange sense of calm. For once, my first thought wasn't fear or shame, but clarity. I had spent my whole life bending, reshaping myself, swallowing words, desperate for approval. But something had cracked open inside me the night before. I had said no, and the world hadn't ended. My parents hadn't shown up at my wedding. They had gambled with my future. They had dismissed my worth at every turn. And now, finally, I was ready to treat them the way they had always treated me, like someone expendable when it didn't suit their needs. That day, I sat at the kitchen table with Ethan, documents spread around us like battle plans. My lawyer had helped me negotiate with the bank, carving out an unusual arrangement. I wouldn't pay a cent toward the missed loan payments. Instead, my name would be removed from the loan in exchange for a lien against any inheritance I might one day receive. The bank didn't like it at first, but with my lawyer's persistence and my clean business credit, they agreed. It was the first time I felt the power of standing up for myself legally, not just emotionally. That evening, I called my father back. He answered on the first ring, his voice clipped. Tell me you've transferred the money. No, I said firmly, and I won't. His silence was heavy, then sharp. This isn't the time for petty revenge because we missed your wedding. This is a financial emergency. Do not contact me about trivial matters, I said, letting the words drip with the same condescension my mother had used when dismissing my wedding. He sputtered on the other end, outraged. What did you just say? Trivial matters, I repeated, my voice steady. Loan payments, foreclosures, credit scores. Trivial compared to the things you've told me never mattered, like my marriage. This is outrageous, he snapped. Your mother and I gave you everything. Accept your presence at my wedding. Accept your respect for my career. Accept unconditional love. His voice cracked, caught between fury and disbelief. You'll regret this. Family has to come first. Exactly, I said quietly. Family should come first. Remember that the next time you're choosing between a luau in Cancun and your daughter's vows. And then I hung up. For a moment, the silence in my living room felt like a cathedral. Ethan reached across the table, squeezing my hand. How do you feel? He asked softly. Lighter, I whispered again. Like I finally put down a burden I've carried my entire life. But the fallout was immediate. Within 24 hours, my phone began buzzing with messages from extended relatives. My Aunt Sophia, my mother's sister, left a long voicemail dripping with disappointment. How could you abandon your poor father in his time of need? My cousin Robert accused me of being childish and vindictive. Even my grandmother, usually the peacekeeper, called to ask if I really refused to help my parents with what she described as a temporary setback. Not one of them mentioned the wedding. Not one acknowledged Cancun. To them, the narrative was simple. I was the ungrateful daughter who turned her back on family loyalty. My parents wasted no time making sure the story spread. 3 days later, Victoria called. I almost ignored it, but curiosity won. Her voice was sharp, impatient. You need to fix this, Clara. Dad is a wreck. Mom hasn't stopped crying. Hello to you too, I said. How was Cancun? Her sigh crackled through the line. Is that what this is about? You're punishing them for missing your wedding? Grow up, Clara. Life isn't all about you. I laughed bitterly. Of course you'd say that. You've been the center of their universe since birth. You wouldn't understand what it feels like to be invisible in your own family. This is about Dad, she pressed. He made some mistakes. You need to step up. No, I said, my voice sharpening. This is about boundaries. He made financial decisions that endangered me without my consent. He expected me to bail him out right after choosing a vacation over the most important day of my life. That's not a mistake, that's a pattern. You're jealous, she said flatly. You've always been jealous of me, my career, my family, my relationship with Mom and Dad. This is just another way of acting out. I'm not jealous, I said softly. I chose a different life. One that makes me happy. All I ever wanted was respect. For them to show up when it mattered. For them to acknowledge me, the way they acknowledge you. Is that really so unreasonable? There was silence on the line. For a moment I thought she might soften, but then she muttered, "The kids need dinner," and hung up. I sat there staring at the phone, the hollow ache in my chest mingling with something harder resolve. Ethan became my anchor during the storm. He never once told me to cave, never suggested I reconcile for peace. Instead, he helped me keep meticulous records, emails, texts, bank statements. If they want to twist the story, he told me, make sure you have the truth on your side. To my surprise, not everyone in the family swallowed my parents' version. My Aunt Karen, the same one who walked me down the aisle, called me. I'm proud of you, she said bluntly. Your mother's always played favorites. Someone needed to hold her accountable. My cousin Danielle texted me. Welcome to the other side. It's lonely here, but it's better. Call me if you need someone who gets it. Even my Uncle Peter, my father's brother, emailed to say he admired my independence, though he wouldn't take sides. Their support was like a lifeline. For the first time, I realized I wasn't crazy, I wasn't cruel, and I wasn't alone. Standing up for myself didn't make me the villain, it made me free. Still, freedom comes with consequences. My parents were furious, Victoria was distant, and half the family looked at me like I'd betrayed them. But as I poured myself into my work and into my marriage, I began to notice something strange. The more distance I created between myself and their judgment, the stronger I felt. The more I refused to bend, the straighter I stood. But even as I rebuilt, one question haunted me. What happens when the people who raised you, the people who shaped your very sense of self, become strangers? Can you really walk away and still carry on as if nothing happened? That question lingered, heavy and unresolved, as I threw myself into my growing business and into building a home with Ethan. I didn't know then that life would soon force me to face my parents again, in a setting where loss and grief blurred the lines, and where even the hardest boundaries could be tested. After I drew the line with my parents, the silence was deafening at first. No more demanding phone calls, no more coldly delivered judgments, no more strings tugging at me from hundreds of miles away. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, terrifying but also exhilarating. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for their approval. I wasn't trying to prove myself. I was finally free to build my life on my own terms. I threw myself into my business like a woman possessed. I expanded my photography studio, renting a loft space in downtown Seattle that had tall windows and exposed brick, a place that felt raw and authentic, just like the kind of work I wanted to create. I hired a third associate photographer to keep up with the demand. We redesigned the studio into a gallery space where clients could see our work displayed like fine art. My calendar filled up a year in advance. Couples flew me across the country to photograph their weddings, and I even got inquiries from abroad. Then one morning, an email landed in my inbox from a prestigious wedding magazine. They wanted to feature my work in their spring issue. When I opened the attachment and saw the spread a series of my photos under the headline "The Emotion Artist," my throat tightened. For years my parents told me photography wasn't a real career, just a hobby, a distraction. And now here it was, printed in glossy pages, called revolutionary by an industry that mattered. I celebrated with Ethan that night. Champagne on our small balcony overlooking the city. He lifted his glass to me and said, "To building something no one else thought you could." And I realized he was right. Every late night, every moment of doubt, every brush off from my family, it had all led here. This wasn't just success. This was survival turned into triumph. Ethan's own career was blossoming too. He was promoted to lead teacher, designing an arts-integrated curriculum that his principal called groundbreaking. I watched him pour the same passion into his students that I poured into my photography, and it made me fall in love with him all over again. At home, we renovated our apartment into a space that reflected both of us, his shelves of books and lesson plans, blending with my framed prints and camera gear. We traveled when we could, taking weekend trips through Oregon wine country, long drives to the coast, planning a bigger trip to Europe for the following summer. For the first time, my home felt like a sanctuary, not a performance. But even with all the growth and success, I couldn't fully silence the old ghosts. There were moments, quiet, unexpected, when the ache of their absence returned. I'd catch myself wondering if my mother had seen the magazine feature, if my father knew how much my business had grown. Did they ever sit in their house, surrounded by Victoria's accolades, and wonder about me? Or was I still an afterthought, a daughter lost to their obsession with status? The answer came 6 months later in a letter from the bank. My name had been officially removed from the Madison property loan. My father, somehow, had found the money to catch up on payments. I suspected he'd liquidated investments or borrowed from friends, but he never told me. The property didn't go into foreclosure, and my credit, while bruised, began to recover. It was proof that the world hadn't collapsed without me. They had found a way without my help, just as I had found a way without their validation. Therapy helped me make sense of the tangled grief that followed. My therapist's office became a place where I could finally exhale, where I could say the things I'd never dared admit. She helped me understand that their inability to value me wasn't a reflection of my worth but of their limitations. "You can't make someone love you the way you need to be loved," she told me once. "But you can stop accepting less than you deserve." That sentence stayed with me like scripture. 1 year after our wedding, Ethan surprised me with a weekend getaway to a small coastal town in Oregon. He booked a bed and breakfast, arranged for a private dinner on the beach, and filled the room with flowers. As we toasted to our first anniversary, I realized how much had changed in 12 months. I was calmer, more grounded, no longer defined by the chase for approval that had once consumed me. For the first time, I wasn't running. "What are you thinking about?" Ethan asked, watching me with the same patience he always had. "That I've finally stopped trying to earn something that was never going to come," I said quietly. "I've been running after their love my whole life, and now, I don't need it anymore." He reached for my hand. "You were always enough. I'm just glad you finally see it too." We talked about the future that night, about children. The idea both thrilled and terrified me. I worried about repeating patterns, about passing down the conditional love I had grown up with. But my therapist's words echoed again. Awareness was the first step to breaking cycles. And deep down, I knew I wanted to build a family defined by acceptance, not comparison. Still, the distance with my parents lingered. After months of silence, my mother sent a carefully worded email around Christmas, asking about our plans. I replied politely but firmly that we would be spending the holidays with Ethan's family. Since then, we kept a fragile truce, short emails, occasional phone calls, conversations about weather and neutral topics. Nothing deep, nothing real. It was civility, not connection. And yet, even in that distance, I felt something shifting. It was as if, in drawing my boundary, I had finally forced them to reckon with the fact that I wasn't their fallback anymore. I no longer bent to fit their mold. I had carved out my own life, one they couldn't control or dismiss. But boundaries are not walls, and grief has a way of sneaking through even the strongest defenses. I didn't know it then, but life was about to test me in a new way. Because just as I had settled into the peace of living on my terms, a sudden loss in the family would drag us all back into the same room again, forcing me to face the people I had worked so hard to keep at arm's length. When my Uncle Jack died suddenly of a heart attack, the grief hit me harder than I expected. He had been one of the few relatives who made me feel seen, the man who walked me down the aisle when my own father chose a beach in Cancun instead. Losing him felt like losing a tether, one of the last connections to the idea that family could be steady, loyal, unconditional. When I got the call, I sat on the floor of my studio, surrounded by half-finished photo edits, and cried in a way I hadn't allowed myself to cry in years. Ethan and I flew to Chicago for the funeral. I insisted on booking a hotel instead of staying with relatives. I needed a place to retreat, to breathe. Walking into my Aunt Karen's house for the reception after the service, I felt the tension knotting in my chest. I hadn't seen my parents or Victoria since the financial fallout, since the confrontation where I told my father his loan was a trivial matter. The thought of facing them again, with grief in the air and relatives watching, felt like stepping back into a minefield. At the church, my parents arrived just before the service began. They looked older than I remembered. My father's hair had gone completely gray, and my mother's figure seemed smaller, her once imposing presence diminished. They didn't approach me, just a nod in my direction, as if acknowledging an acquaintance, not a daughter. Victoria and her family sat with them in the front row. Ethan and I sat several rows back, next to Karen, my heart aching with both loss and the familiar sting of being kept at a distance. The service was beautiful, filled with stories of Jack's generosity, his humor, the way he showed up for people without needing recognition. Listening to the eulogies, I couldn't stop thinking of the contrast how he had chosen to be the father figure mine never was. Afterward, at the reception in Karen's kitchen, I was helping arrange trays of food when my mother walked in. The air shifted immediately. We stood in silence for a moment, both of us awkward in the small space. Finally, she spoke. "Your photography business seems to be doing well," she said, rearranging cookies on a tray that didn't need rearranging. "I saw the magazine feature." Her words startled me. I hadn't expected her to know, let alone acknowledge it. "Yes," I said carefully. "It's been a good year." She nodded, still avoiding my eyes. "Your father and I are selling the house. It's too big for just the two of us now." I wondered if she expected sympathy, but all I felt was the unspoken truth that the downsizing was financial necessity, not choice. "Still," I only said, "I'm sorry to hear that. We found a condo closer to Victoria," she continued, as though I had asked. "Smaller, but adequate." I nodded. unsure what role I was supposed to play in this conversation. Then she glanced at me, her voice softening. The Madison property sold last month. Not for as much as your father hoped, but enough to clear the loan. Relief flickered through me. I'm glad it worked out, I said honestly. I hadn't wanted them to face ruin, even if I refused to be their safety net. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with years of unsaid words. Finally, she straightened her shoulders, that familiar gesture of control. Your father and I may have been hasty in our assessment of your wedding, she said carefully. We regret missing it. It wasn't quite an apology, more like a half-step, a concession she couldn't fully give. But from her, it was monumental. Thank you for saying that, I replied quietly. It means something to hear it. Her eyes flickered with something I couldn't read. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, Ethan seems like a good man. The best, I said, and for the first time, I felt no need to defend him. She picked up the tray of cookies. I should get these out to the guests. And then she was gone, leaving me standing in the kitchen, my heart pounding. It was such a small exchange, less than 5 minutes, but it felt like the first crack in a wall that had stood my entire life. Not reconciliation, not forgiveness, but the faintest suggestion that maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to see me, not the daughter she wanted, but the woman I had become. In the weeks that followed, I replayed that conversation in my head. Was it real? A shift, however slight? Or was it just a moment of weakness brought on by grief and the practical realities of downsizing? I couldn't tell, but something in me wanted to believe it was the start of a different chapter. That belief deepened when, 2 months later, I discovered I was pregnant. Holding the test in my shaking hands, I felt a wave of emotions: joy, fear, awe. Ethan lifted me off the floor when I told him, laughing and crying at the same time. We're going to be parents, he whispered into my hair, his voice filled with wonder. We decided to wait until the end of the first trimester before sharing the news. But even in those early weeks, our home changed. Every choice felt infused with purpose: what kind of parents we wanted to be, what kind of life we wanted to create for this child. When the time came to tell our families, Ethan's parents cried happy tears, immediately offering cribs and babysitting. With my parents, I braced myself. I expected the usual polite acknowledgement, nothing more. But when I told my mother over the phone, there was a gasp. A baby. Oh, Clara, that's wonderful news. Her voice held a tone I hadn't heard in years, something close to genuine warmth. We spoke for nearly 30 minutes, the longest conversation we'd had in over a year. She asked about my health, my feelings, even my hopes for motherhood. Before hanging up, she hesitated. Your father and I would like to visit after the baby comes, if that would be all right. It was an olive branch, tentative, but real. And in that moment, I felt the tension between fear and hope coil inside me. Could becoming a mother myself create the bridge that years of fighting had failed to build? Or would opening that door only invite more of the pain I had worked so hard to escape? The answer, I knew, would come when the baby arrived. And with each passing week, as my belly grew and my body changed, I braced myself for the moment when my family would meet the child who might either heal old wounds or expose them more than ever before. When my daughter Lily was born, everything I thought I knew about love and family shifted. The moment they placed her in my arms, I understood what unconditional love really meant. It wasn't about accomplishments or appearances, or about fitting into someone else's expectations. It was about presence, about devotion, about the quiet but fierce promise that I would never let her doubt her worth. Holding her tiny body against my chest, I realized that the cycle of conditional love, the one that had defined my entire childhood, was ending with me. Watching my parents meet Lily for the first time was surreal. My father, who had always been so rigid, softened as he cradled her. My mother, usually reserved, brought gifts she said had been passed down in our family, a music box and a silver bracelet. There were moments when I almost didn't recognize them. But even then, I knew better than to believe that everything had changed overnight. What shifted wasn't who they were, it was who I was. I had finally stopped measuring my value by their approval. I was no longer waiting for them to become the parents I needed. I had become the parent I needed. That is what peace feels like. Not the absence of sadness, because there are still moments when I mourn the family I never truly had. But peace is the presence of something stronger, the ability to accept reality without letting it define my worth. I no longer crave their validation, because I know who I am. I know what I've built with Ethan, with Lily, with the home we've created where love is never conditional and joy is found in the ordinary. If there's one lesson my story has taught me, it's that family isn't just about blood. Family is about presence, respect, and reciprocity. Sometimes the people we are born to can't love us the way we need, and that is not our failure. It's theirs. But we still have the power to choose the people who show up, to choose the love that nurtures instead of diminishes, to choose to break the patterns that hurt us and replace them with something healthier, something stronger. If you've been waiting your whole life for someone's approval, let me be the one to tell you, you don't need it. Your worth is not something anyone else gets to define. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is draw a boundary and walk toward the life that truly belongs to you. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, please like this video, leave a comment, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear these words. And I'll leave you with this question. Have you ever had to redefine what family means to you? And if so, what did that new definition look like?